Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Well, we're here with Dr. Paul Carrese, and the most recent of our constitutional conversations, which we hold from time to time here at the James Madison Foundation in Alexandria, Virginia. Dr. Carrese is the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. For 2 decades, he was a civilian professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he co-founded and directed the Academy's Great Books Honors Program. He's been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, a Fulbright Fellow at Delhi University in India, and a visiting fellow in the James Madison Program at Princeton. Dr. Carrese has published many articles and book chapters, but he is an expert, I think it's fair to say, on the political philosophy and the legacy of the Baron de Montesquieu, Montesquieu as we call him, a French Enlightenment thinker, a jurist. And so, Dr. Carrese, let's begin. Tell us who Montesquieu was and why we should be interested in him today.
Thank you, Jeff. First, I should say it's an honor to be working with the James Madison Foundation and to be talking with you. These questions of our constitutional history and the ideas behind them are so crucial. They always have been, but they're very important right now. So, yes, thank you for talking about Montesquieu. He's less well known than his important counterpart, John Locke, as a crucial source of the philosophical political ideas that make America as a republic what we are. Locke writes in English. Locke has a sort of cleaner, clearer philosophy. Locke is more influential on the Declaration of Independence because Locke's philosophy includes this argument for revolution if natural rights are violated. But Montesquieu is so important, I think, during the period of the arguments about revolution and the Declaration. And then by the 1780s, as the Americans, somehow successful in the Revolutionary War, have to face the question of how will we actually structure institutions and governments. The state constitutions have to be written, then the Articles of Confederation are attempted, and after a few years, it's thought some revision to the Articles is needed. And so Montesquieu is the great authority of the political science of free peoples writing constitutions, structuring their politics so as to sustain freedom. So many of us have not heard of Montesquieu, but we have heard of the separation of powers and 3 branches of a government, which is in many of our state constitutions and obviously in the federal 1787 Constitution. We've heard of federalism, the idea of a federation of republics. These ideas in these particular forms come directly from Montesquieu. So another way of thinking about this is that, as many people would know, we have great debates about the ratification of the 1787 Constitution in 1787 into 1788. And both sides, state by state in the ratification debates, are citing one authority more than any other. The Constitution should be ratified because Montesquieu would say this is right about it and that's right about it. And the other side, the Anti-Federalists, as we call them, saying this Constitution should not be ratified, it needs to be amended, maybe scrapped altogether because Montesquieu would criticize it in this way and this way. So he has fallen a bit in the past, I would say, certainly decades and maybe longer. He's fallen out of our everyday vocabulary in universities and in high schools and elsewhere as so crucially important. So the Madison Foundation is doing a favor by talking about this important philosopher. Part of his philosophy was that peoples in places around the world who wanted free government, a more moderate kind of politics, would have to decide for themselves just how to take very large, important principles of justice and adapt them and apply them. So I think he would understand that both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were citing him, disagreeing about just what what he meant. But it's fair to say that we would not be the federal constitutional republic of the United States of America in the way that we are if this 18th century French Enlightenment philosopher had not written this big book, The Spirit of Laws, that was fairly quickly translated into English and had enormous influence in college students like James Madison in Princeton, New Jersey, and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, and Alexander Hamilton, and other great leaders of our constitutional order were studying this book like a textbook of political science. So it's had a great effect.
What was it in the Federalist camp, that is, those who were in favor of the new Constitution, persons like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, who had helped to write that Constitution? Why does Hamilton speak of the great Montesquieu, the great man Montesquieu? Why does Madison call him the celebrated Montesquieu when they are trying to argue in favor of the new Constitution?
It's an interesting fact about our university academic culture now. I said we do spend much more time thinking about Locke, other late Enlightenment philosophers, say Immanuel Kant, and we forget that in the Federalist itself and in the ratification debate, figures who scholars now refer to as the moderate Enlightenment are much more important. So Montesquieu is cited repeatedly in the Federalist and by Anti-Federalist writers. William Blackstone, a great English jurist who cites Montesquieu as an influence on his thinking about the Constitution of England. Blackstone is cited in the Federalist. David Hume, Scottish Enlightenment, these more moderate figures. We as academics tend to like the more bright-line and somewhat more radical thinkers like Locke or Immanuel Kant or Hobbes or Machiavelli. So Montesquieu is celebrated because The Spirit of Laws is a very comprehensive, it's a large book, comprehensive book trying to make very well-rounded, balanced arguments for what a politics of liberty is and could be, what a more moderate and humane politics could be. And even though Amazon.com was not around at the time, the book sold like hotcakes. When it was published, The Spirit of Laws is published in 1748 written in French, fairly quickly translated into English. It sells all over Europe. Translations are made into other languages. All the major language groups of Europe have, within just a few years, even into Russian, have translations of The Spirit of Laws. And then Montesquieu had visited England in the 1730s to learn about the political culture of liberty, the Constitution of Liberty, as he called it. So there are two long chapters in The Spirit of Laws about this new kind of politics that Montesquieu calls a blend of a monarchy and a republic that has a separation of powers, that is a powerful, capable state in world affairs, but is not too much of one thing or too much of another. It has elements of a monarchy and that it has a powerful navy, it's a presence in the world, but it has raucous political liberty and the rule of law and a complicated constitutional structure. Well, this ends up being very important for the American colonies for thinking about their forms of government. Then in the arguments for revolution and forming separate states and constitutions, they have this political science textbook to draw upon. And each side thinks of him as celebrated for the reason that he, as you said, he's a baron. He's of the high nobility in France, but arguing for liberty and the rule of law and a moderate politics, warning against more absolutist monarchies, saying some good things about republics and blending monarchies and republics. So the sort of comprehensiveness and the balance of his philosophy from a nobleman who could have just defended the old order simply makes him this really, to use a phrase, a celebrity intellectual figure.
It occurs to me that Americans, for the most part, were skeptical of the French Enlightenment principles that very quickly are instantiated in their own revolution in France, and which becomes bloody and violent and excessive in ways the American Enlightenment never did become. So what is Montesquieu's relationship to the French Enlightenment, to the Enlightenment as a whole? Is he a philosophe like some of the other more radical thinkers? And why are Americans comfortable with him when they seem not to be so comfortable with the more radical elements of the French Enlightenment?
The American founders at the time do think of him as an Enlightenment figure, a philosophe, as you said. Scholars, French citizens today who are proud of Montesquieu and what he has brought to the world refer to him as a philosophe. At the end of his life, Montesquieu contributed to the great Enlightenment philosophy project of the Encyclopedia, the French Encyclopedia. He writes an article. He was famous for an earlier work he wrote in the 1720s. It was actually the first philosophical novel. It's called Persian Letters. And the fact that a nobleman, a senior judge in a court and a baron would write such a thoughtful but somewhat scandalous account of European politics and the monarchy, that made him famous. And then he becomes famous for this encyclopedic, comprehensive book, The Spirit of Laws, which really cemented his status not just as an intellectual, but a philosopher of the high rank among modern philosophers. He's the equivalent of a Hobbes or a Locke or a Spinoza. And in his intellectual merit and engagement with the issues of the Enlightenment, he's the equivalent or the peer of a Voltaire. We know that Rousseau reads him very carefully, and Rousseau takes some ideas for his own, I would argue, more radical philosophy from Montesquieu. And actually, to be honest, it's probably one reason over the centuries we don't pay as much attention to Montesquieu as the American framers did, because he was a sort of blend of what we would call liberal and conservative. He did have some more, let's say, progressive or liberal elements, as I was mentioning. Here's high nobility, a baron, interested in liberty and interested in reforming constitutions, interested in principles of natural right and justice for all human beings. And so that seems like it's more progressive and maybe radical, but he's so careful to be balanced. We can talk more about this. He has a principle of moderation, of balance, explicitly in his philosophy. So this makes him safer in a certain way and more useful and adaptable to broader political communities that might be interested in reading him. So we probably, it's fair to say, have university communities in America that over centuries have become more dominated by the more progressive and let's say the left side of the intellectual perspective. In some way, maybe more of the children of the French Revolution, impatient for reform. And while Montesquieu was celebrated at the time of the French Revolution, he was thought to be inspirational in France for the idea of reforming the monarchy. That early idea of the revolution itself, of reforming the monarchy, as you mentioned, fell away toward the idea of repudiating the monarchy. And then Montesquieu's own stock within France fell. And even figures like Jefferson in the United States, who were, at one time, early in his life, Jefferson was very deeply influenced by Montesquieu, praised Montesquieu. The later Jefferson, after the French Revolution, begins to take more of this more radical French view that, well, Montesquieu was much too friendly to aristocracy, and he was much too friendly to monarchy, and he was much too friendly to gradual reform rather than radical replacement of unjust modes of politics. So as I was saying, this is why scholars often refer to Montesquieu now as part of the moderate Enlightenment. He's clearly a modern. He's clearly, while very knowledgeable about classical and medieval thought and the Christian tradition, he's clearly this modern, more liberal figure, an Enlightenment figure looking to spread ideas of justice and political reform to all peoples and all political ranks and orders. But he does it in this complicated, more balanced way that is aware of philosophy and new ideas of philosophy may be going too far.
Let's revisit this notion of what Americans were drawn to in Montesquieu? You've mentioned some of the features of his work that were appealing to the Federalists, that is, those who wanted a stronger central government. What about their opponents, those Anti-Federalists that you mentioned? What features of Montesquieu did they find appealing, and did they use to try to argue down this proposed constitution?
Montesquieu was moderate in the Enlightenment because he was much less critical of Christianity and of religion. And as I also mentioned, much less sure that sweeping away aristocracy or sweeping away monarchy to bring fresh new forms of politics, that would be good, that it would always have good results. A later French figure said of him in a tribute that he was the greatest friend to Christianity of any philosopher of the 18th century. That's something of a backhanded compliment. There was a lot of, in the Enlightenment in Europe, including in France, a lot of criticism of Christianity, of the church dominating the state or the throne or the monarchy, and Christianity, especially Catholicism, is backward-looking. But it is significant that he would be seen as seeing both what was so important in Christianity to contributing to human liberty even, and a more humane politics, a more gentle politics, while also being critical of the wrong kinds of influence that the Catholic Church or other kinds of Christianity might have in politics. So the Anti-Federalists appreciated that he, as part of his philosophy, paid attention to topics like religion, integrated into study of institutions and laws and policies. So what the Anti-Federalists appreciated in Montesquieu is that he thought about culture in relation to institutions and what we think of as politics more narrowly, including religion. And he had written in The Spirit of Laws about republics and the kind of civic virtue and civic education needed to have free citizens of free republics. And they found that very attractive. The Federalists found that attractive as well. But the Anti-Federalists wanted to use it in part as a criticism of the Federalist Constitution, so to speak, with its emphasis on uniting the states, the republics, in order to promote commerce and the large scale of such a republic, which had never been attempted before. And there's a passage in The Spirit of Laws in which Montesquieu says republics by their nature have to be small. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 9, which sort of sets up the famous Federalist Number 10 essay written by Madison as Publius. In Number 9, Hamilton points out, of course, the Anti-Federalists have a point. Montesquieu does say in one part of The Spirit of Laws, republics have to be small. But in another part, which apparently the Anti-Federalists haven't read, done their homework, he says republics can form federations of republics in order to meet the reality that they live in a world dominated by monarchies. They live in a world dominated by empires. And in order to be free, they can't think only about domestic freedom. They have to think about the military capability, the size, and general capacity needed to maintain their freedom, either by deterring war or by surviving and succeeding if they are attacked. And so here's Montesquieu saying, well, a federation of republics, a federal republic, he calls it, can be the best of both worlds. It can have the culture of liberty on a smaller scale that is the essence of republics, and yet a group of republics can band together to achieve this other element they need, which is a larger scale of collective liberty. He also adds, Montesquieu, that there can be a way in which the domestic politics will change in each of the republics if they're part of a larger federal republic. They may sort of take off the rough edges and balance each other out in certain ways. So again, as I was saying, The Spirit of Laws is so comprehensive and so balanced, and also, while having a lot of detail, also very general, that it makes sense that both Anti-Federalists and Federalists could say they were being truer to Montesquieu's spirit, or we ought to emphasize this element of Montesquieu's philosophy as more relevant to us here in America. I think a general background point here, by the way, is that Montesquieu would appreciate, and he writes about this among the English, that free people will debate and argue. And so he would be flattered that he was so important, but also understand that even one philosopher can be interpreted in different ways, and Americans would argue about his influences, what free people do. We argue and we disagree.
Now, let's talk about moderation.
Yes.
And if you like, allude to the book that you've written on that topic and how that spirit of moderation, if you will, informed the American experiment in ordered liberty.
Yes. Montesquieu came along and was translated into English and hit America just at a time that moderation was more accepted and popular as a concept than it might be now. And the idea of moderation, as Montesquieu defines it, is that in political affairs, just as in other dimensions of life, we can all think of a good idea that goes too far, or we can identify something as extreme, or it's become extreme. Aristotle had originally contributed this idea in thinking about virtues, excellences of human beings, that the way to define a virtue like courage is to find it as the right mean, the right middle ground, the right moderate point between two maybe temptations or tendencies that are at the extremes. Montesquieu adopts this explicitly as the central principle of his political philosophy, that the political good, he said, will always be found between extremes. The spirit of the philosopher and of the legislator and the statesman ought to be the spirit of moderation. So, as I mentioned earlier, these two kind of structural principles that many Americans would know about, and we can trace directly to Montesquieu, the separation of powers in a government, and then another kind of separation of powers, federalism, a federal republic in which there's a real government in say, the center or at the federal level, and there are real governments in the member states. Those are kinds of balances that in Montesquieu's way of explaining them, the English have versions of them, they help politics to be better because they make it less likely that the whole political order will go to an extreme. The legislature won't dominate, the executive won't dominate, the judges and lawyers, the judiciary won't dominate, if they're all, on the one hand, separated from each other and then balanced against or balanced with each other. Federalism, the federal republic, it will be better both for the smaller the smaller republics, the states, and better for the whole if each has the other, and each in a way has to argue with and contend with the other. So moderation is partly a negative principle. It's avoiding an extreme. It's avoiding something bad that could happen in politics. It's also, for Montesquieu, a positive principle. You're likely to get more justice. It's a higher middle ground rather than a lower middle ground, or at least it's meant to be. With these complicated structures, if you have multiple powers and bodies that have to argue with each other, you'll produce better ideas, more just ideas, if you have this structure producing balance. And then we have to use, the title of his book says, we have to have the right spirit. We have to have the right education and the right approach to use these complicated constitutional institutions in the right way.
Is there a particular actor on the American stage who you think most embodies this sort of moderate philosophy and perhaps the element of the new science of politics that Montesquieu is putting forth?
Well, it won't surprise you, since you're an expert scholar on George Washington, if I say it is George Washington. There are other figures deeply influenced by Montesquieu and shaped by him, but I do think, for the paradoxical reason that Washington didn't directly read and study Montesquieu, but he was very attentive to the fact that there are smart people around him, younger, smart people, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, George Mason, others, and they were all very deeply knowledgeable of Montesquieu. And as he listens to them and presides over 3 months of the Federal Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, this resonates with elements of Washington's own character and his own experience and his education. And he was sort of Lincoln before Lincoln. He was aware that he didn't have formal college education, and so he read a lot, bought a lot of books and read a lot and wanted smart people around him. So it is paradoxical to think that he's the probably single figure that best embodies the philosophy of moderation in Montesquieu, even though he was not as well read in Montesquieu as these other figures. So just a couple of examples from Washington's own life, that he's a very powerful man physically, he's a very ambitious man, but and sort of an old-fashioned idea from Cicero and from Christianity that Montesquieu talks about and adopts, that powerful people can do good things, but to be a decent, humane, Christian, powerful person in politics, you have to be more moderate and moderate yourself and moderate your ambitions, especially the idea of serving. So Washington is the public servant general who somehow conquers, through his own prudence and extraordinary diligence and those of others. He wins that war and immediately resigns his commission as soon as it's clear that the victory is safe, the peace treaty will adequately protect the revolution. That's a striking of a balance. He holds an extraordinary power. He's really kind of the president of the United States already as the chief diplomat and single executive, and yet he resigns his commission to the Confederation Congress and retires. He comes back at the request of others into public life, doesn't even want to serve 2 terms. He wants to resign after his first term. The moderation principle there is, while it's important that he was the first president, he recognized what he could contribute. He wanted to set the principle that no one person was so important. He didn't think it would be a good idea for him to die in office, as well as just being exhausted and needing needing a rest. But he agrees to serve a second term, and then he insists that he will retire quite deliberately from public life to set the example of this balance of principles. Yes, you can serve and serve well, have great things to contribute, have experience, and yet that should be balanced against the principle of all citizens being important. He opens his farewell address in 1796 by addressing his fellow Americans as friends and fellow citizens. So someone of such ambition and influence and power, when he holds the executive position the second time, he's the single executive with the commander-in-chief power, and yet he holds it and then says, I've done my time, done my service. And by the way, he really does believe in these principles about which he learned so much from his more educated fellow framers, and he hears them debated in the Constitutional Convention. He, as president, repeatedly, from his first inaugural address forward through 8 years to his farewell address, repeatedly endorses the principles of the constitutional separation, distribution of powers, the principle of federalism, that there's only so much the federal government should do according to the Constitution, and then the state governments have their sovereign authorities. And embedded in that, the rule of law and so many other principles that are all part of the Montesquieuan moderation and balance of power. So I would have to pick him as the one single. There's so many good examples, but the one single best example.
Washington has a very good group of, not ghostwriters exactly, but aides in writing that address, who are in fact Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, the pseudonymous writers of the Federalist Papers. So in effect, that farewell address is sort of Federalist number 86. Are there ideas in that with respect to, say, geopolitics or others where Montesquieu is also likewise revealed? We know now that Washington was probably a more foresighted thinker than we've been apt to give him credit for in the past, a more thoughtful person, a keener practical intellect maybe than we've been wont to think of him. In what ways might Montesquieu have shown up in the geopolitics that's sort of a subtext of that farewell address?
Yes, I mentioned earlier today, as I hear, that we don't study and appreciate Montesquieu in our university and elite cultures as much as we should. And this is a further area where we really could benefit from studying him. He was recognized at the time as so comprehensive in this one package of the Spirit of Laws to include and to address the ideas of the right of nations, as he called it, international law, we would call it, as integral with ideas of the domestic politics and the constitutional structure of free and decent and moderate political order. And we know that figures like Jay and Hamilton in particular were shaped by this dimension of Montesquieu's philosophy. The way the American Constitution thinks about what we call the war powers, right? To carefully distribute them, but also make sure that they're there, is a sign of Montesquieu's balanced, moderate philosophy. He writes about this in The Spirit of Laws, that free, moderate political orders need to be capable in a dangerous world of protecting their moderate and free forms of government. As I mentioned earlier, this is why he recommends a federation of republics, a federal republic, as really a new idea, certainly a new idea for a political philosopher, an Enlightenment political philosopher, to endorse it. The idea of a single executive, whether a monarch or republic, being safe for the politics of freedom in a republic rather than a danger, because as long as carefully balanced by and against a separate legislature and a judiciary, this is the kind of capability you need in a dangerous world, to have a decisive single figure who can be foresighted about the complexities of international affairs and can be commanding the military forces that are provided. And it's, again, this balance between what we might call the ugly realities. If you think of a philosopher like Machiavelli, the ugly realities of power politics and war and international affairs, those can't be just ignored because they're ugly. That's balanced in Montesquieu's philosophy with the higher ideals that it is better to think about peaceful relations among states and peoples. It is better to think about commerce, the mutual beneficial, productive relationships of trading, not only goods and money, but ideas. It is better to think about an international law, reason and argument, and the right of nations guiding and governing international affairs. But Montesquieu's argument, his balanced moderate philosophies, you can't think about just one or the other. To be free and to be decent and to be moderate, you can think about both. You have to think about both. You can put them together and strike the right balances. So I think it is not accidental that while we know Montesquieu was so directly influential on the domestic structures of our politics, separation of powers in our state constitutions and the federal constitution, the idea of the federal republic and federalism, it's not accidental that he has this right of nations philosophy about how to be militarily capable and powerful and free and moderate, both at the same time. It's not accidental that America ends up in the history of world affairs as precisely that kind of state or power. And Washington writes in this way about the farewell counsel that he wants to give. After talking about many other political principles, many of which he draws from Montesquieu, his final set of advice is this balanced counsel about what America should be and can be. We should be a great power, but great not only in raw power, but as an example that a free people can be capable in military affairs, respected. You deter war and avoid war by being powerful and capable. And yet an example also of being guided by right and justice, international law, recognized as not a low-minded, low self-interested actor in international affairs, but while taking care of interests, being this example of striking a higher balance. And I do not think it's accidental that 200 years later, we are the world's greatest power, but also the leader of an idea of a federation or alliance of liberal democracies and other states as allies and partners that are not liberal democracies, but willing to ally and partner with us. I don't think it's accidental. I see Montesquieu's hand and his influence there playing out. And so we at least ought to study Montesquieu more and test that out as a proposition.
Yes, well, this has been a splendid tour of Montesquieu and his legacy. And now I'm going to ask a very unfair question of you to wrap us up, and that is to reduce the Montesquieuian ox into a bouillon cube. We know that a large part of our audience on our YouTube channel is educators, college and university professors, and classrooms and students, and secondary and even middle school classrooms. If you could just leave us with a sentence or two about Montesquieu. He's never going to get a musical written about him, but what could you leave us with that our teachers could use in a serviceable way in their environment?
American teachers of civics and history should know this extraordinary fact that a French nobleman from the 18th century who seems so different from America, what we think of as America, had this extraordinary influence on the basic ideas of our forms of politics and government, structure of our Constitution, but also the spirit of our form of politics. And this is in black and white in the founding documents of our political history and the arguments of our ratification debates, that such a seemingly different figure writing in a different language, French, could so deeply shape what America immediately became in the 18th century and early 19th century, but has continued, that influence has continued to percolate through our political culture and our political life. And as I just mentioned, our influence on all of international affairs and really the course of history, that it comes from this one philosopher in France, a nobleman who is foresighted enough to think about liberty and reform and even though from a monarchy, the virtues of republics, especially moderate republics. It's an extraordinary, fascinating story worth learning about and teaching about.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.